Now we are moving to the second part of this morning's substance. Let me again welcome you again, all of you. Actually, there is someone whom I would like to welcome specially. As you know, we will be having many honorable guests coming 2 days, but one of them very special to us already is in the room. It's Bill Coglier. Bill, would you please stand up? Bill is, as you know, we asked a distinguished visiting fellow. He is the former science advisor, Secretary of State of the United States. He's here for this week to work with us on the science diplomacy and on this meeting of science advisors to the foreign ministers for coming for this. Welcome, Bill, very much. Then. We are going to move now to the lecture by Howard Kunreuther. Howard is the James G. Dillon Professor of Decision Science and Business and Public Policy at the Wharton School. As you know, Wharton is collaborating with us a lot. We are proud of that. One of the big projects we are having is the flood risk project together with Zurich. That's very important to us. He has a long-standing interest in ways that society can better manage low probability, high consequence events related to technological and natural hazards. Professor Kunreuther is a fellow of the American Association of Advancement of Science, AAAS, and distinguished fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis. He served on the IPCC as a coordinating lead author for the chapter on integrated risk and uncertainty assessment of climate change response policies in the 2014 report, and currently is part of the NAS-NRC Roundtable on Risk Resilience and Extreme Events. That's for the official part of it. You have heard Howard, of course, in his personal speech about YASA, about Howard Kunreuther, and I think there is much more which is connecting Howard to YASA than just this very dry language of what it really is. So welcome, and let me ask you to come to stage to give your lecture.
Thank you so much, Pavel. What a treat and special honor it is to be with you, as I said earlier, to share some ideas. And it really is so appropriate, as I mentioned, but let me mention again, to make this a tribute to Howard Kunreuther, who stimulated me in so many ways and was a part of YASA throughout his life and has been a real moving force with respect to many of the ideas that I'll be talking about today. So what I want to talk about, and we're going to try to do this in a half hour so we have some time for discussion, is the adaptation to extreme climate events, some challenges and opportunities. And as Pavel indicated, I was involved with the IPCC for a 4-year stint. Joanne was involved on our particular chapter on risk and uncertainty, and we really struggled with respect to how we would address the issue of risk and uncertainty and policy in dealing with these issues. So this is going to be building on some of the themes that came out of the IPCC and frankly the work that we've been doing at the Wharton Risk Center now for certainly we've had our 30th anniversary, and we've from the very beginning have focused on low probability, high consequence events. How does the individual deal with it? How does organizations deal with it? How do governments deal with it? And more recently, on a societal level, how do we deal with this in a real world context? And so let me make sure that I am staying on time and also highlight some of the key points. So I want to start off with the fact that just to give you some notion, we are really in a new era of catastrophes. And if you start looking at the losses that have occurred over time and can see essentially how things have increased, we recognize that this is a major problem. So here is an example, actually, with respect to the fact that if you look at the insured catastrophic losses worldwide between 1970 and 2015, 12 of the 15 occurred after 2000. And you can see what these were. There are enormous problems around the world, and large numbers of lives have been lost in the developing countries, and we are looking at that as part of our Zurich project today, and large numbers of enormous amount of damage that has also occurred. So what's happening here? Why are we having this? Well, there are several factors that are involved, And I think it's important to start with the fact that in many of these high hazard areas, areas subject to floods and earthquakes, they're very, very attractive locations for other reasons. I'll use our own country in the sense of Florida being a place that a lot of people want to go to in order to retire. They want to be near the beach, they want to be near the water, and of course that is what they normally have, but there are hurricanes there, and you've heard about Hurricane Matthew just recently, and they had 4 of them in the year 2004 and another in 2005. They were lucky for a period of time where they haven't had any, but these are really, really areas where you have to ask yourself, do you really want to have urbanization and high values at risk? So certainly that's important, but of course we have climate change, and I know Pavel has been actively involved in the IPCC for many years, and all of you may have had a role, and Naki, of course, who's in Boston now, has played a major role here at YASA on that. And the problem is we have these changing climate conditions. We have sea level rise, no way to ignore that, higher flood damage, major problems on that, and more intense weather-related events. And so we really have a question here that I think I'll just highlight. I was on the New York City climate change panel, I'm still on that panel now, where we were looking at that. I'm not a climate scientist, I should at least let you know. I'm one of those people, I'm an economist, but I'm often called an irrational economist, since I tend to work with psychologists, as you'll see in a moment, looking at decision making under uncertainty in a slightly different way. But the fact is that on the climate risk program, I learned a great deal from the climate scientists, and the reason I was there was looking at policy and looking at the role insurance could play with respect to dealing with that. And so there's a report that came out with respect to the New York City climate change, and you begin to look at some of the data here with respect to what can happen. And in this particular case, you can see even in 2020, you're looking at sea level rise on the average of 4 to 8 inches, and then it could go up as high as 11 inches, and in the 2050s, we're talking about things that are over 2.5 feet with respect to the rise here. And so there are major problems we're facing here that we have to deal with. This is probably more scary than it should be, but it is a map that I show. Looks like Vienna is relatively safe, but London and others may have a real problem with respect to what would happen if the Greenland ice sheet melts. And you can see essentially what could occur, and there's a lot that's been written on that. I only show that as a sort of a graphic of the highest order, but it also points out we have to be concerned about these particular problems. So, let me say something about Austria. And normally when I like to learn about what each of the countries are doing, and if I've given countries in other parts of the world, I just try to focus on this, and I'm going to spend a little time while I'm here in YASA over the next few days and be happy to meet with some of you discussing essentially the flooding problems, not only in Austria or other parts, but you can see essentially in 2013, these are some pictures of what happened to flooding in Linz and on the Inn River and in Steyr with respect to that. Now, the reason I want to put this up as Austria is, I want to spend a moment just focusing on Austria's way that they are dealing with flood insurance, because my talk today will be related to how do we begin to link science and policy on the one hand, understanding what the actual risks are, with ways that we can actually reduce these risks with respect to floods. And I think that each country has their own set of institutions and culture in dealing with this risk. I'll be actually spending some time with a number of people here at YASA over the next couple of days talking about issues of equity and efficiency and how to deal with it. We'll take a look at essentially how things are done here. Flood insurance is normally part of a natural disaster package. That's a very good thing because it sort of combines the risks together, something we don't have, by the way, in the United States. And I'll mention something about the U.S. a little later on. So the idea of putting things together makes a lot of sense. It isn't required as a condition for a mortgage. That, I think, raises some questions with respect to who has it. So Joanne and Suzanne Hanger have done a survey of 600 Austrians in 4 provinces, and what they found is about 50% of the people had flood insurance in areas that had been flooded. There's very low coverage, interestingly enough, here in this country. Apparently, it does a very good job of covering a lot of the losses, but if you have a large loss, it could be really quite disastrous for the individual, about 7,500 euros. There's very limited incentives. This is true in the United States. This is true around the world, and something that I'll be focusing on reducing that flood risk. People don't get any premium discounts. If you have an insurance policy and you actually then do something to reduce the risk and reduce the claims, you should be getting basically a discount because you now have the costs are less to the insurance company or the government, whoever's providing insurance. That isn't the case here. It isn't the case to a large extent in the United States as well. So I'm not singling out Austria, but I think we should ask ourselves, is this possibly the way to go? There are some low-interest loans to help from municipalities. There are production measures, and I think that Austria is very, very positive in terms of the role the public sector plays here in levees and dams, concrete foundations in new homes. These are for individual things. They do it for the community as well as for the individual homes. What about disaster relief? And this is the challenge we face in any of these areas. If you don't take protection beforehand, and then the government comes to the rescue afterwards, there's much less incentive for you to actually protect yourself against the risk if you think you're going to be rescued by the public sector. Well, here, there is a fund for providing assistance to cover 50 to 100% of the loss, but here's one of the problems. Generally, the fund isn't going to cover the insured losses. So one municipality, as I point out, a province has done that from what I've learned. There may be other things I'm not aware of, but in the research that I did, essentially suggests that they will provide only beyond insurance. But if they're not going to cover the insured losses, what incentive do you have to take out insurance? Why should you be paying for a premium and then find out you're not getting coverage for disaster relief, and you could save that money on the premium and get a larger coverage? So that doesn't make a lot of sense with respect to how you want to think about an integrated policy. And in most provinces, and this is something I will talk about, affordability as a part of a challenge here, it's conditional, the relief is conditional on some kind of economic hardship. So that's Austria, that's the problem, but it sets the tone for what I want to talk about. It sets the tone for the notion that you want to begin to ask yourself, what kind of a program do we want to put together that can provide incentives for people and governments and countries to take protection beforehand in order to avoid the large losses afterwards? Climate change has exacerbated that problem. We've had an enormous difficulty, as you know, in the United States, even recognizing climate change, even using the word. I think that's changing in the last couple of years. We can at least say something, and hopefully things will happen. You're doing much better in Austria, and you're doing much better in Europe in terms of dealing with that issue. So that sets the tone for what I want to talk about. So here are the questions I want to address. I want to look at mitigation. Mitigation, by what I mean by that is not mitigation of greenhouse gas in this case, although, but really adaptation. Mitigation and dealing with affordability. So I want to first focus, as Joanne alluded to in her remarks, that she said I was going to talk a bit about intuitive and deliberative thinking. How do homeowners reside in hazard-prone areas and make decisions on whether to invest in protective measures prior to the next disaster? And let me say something about Howard Kunreuther on that score. That's precisely the kind of thing that I could say I gained from Howard, and all of us have gained. We've got to understand how people actually do make decisions in order to be able to say how we can deal with them. The real world concept, the real notion of that is important. We also have to think about what we would like them to do, and that's very important, and the statistical aspects and the risk assessment are critical. So then I'm going to mention three guiding principles and the role that insurance can play in dealing with this, and then in particular how insurance can encourage two things that are missing in a lot of these programs today that we have been spending some time working with, not only at our risk center, but trying to work with the U.S. Congress, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to ask ourselves, how can we do a better job of addressing both loss reduction and affordability? So those are the themes that I want to sort of focus on. Okay, so let's talk about intuitive and deliberative thinking and linking them together. Daniel Kahneman's, let me just get a feeling. How many people are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow? Great, great. So you are really sort of will be tuned in. And I'm going to just summarize very quickly a couple of the points that he made. What Kahneman has done in the book is summarize research that has gone on for the last 30 or 40 years in psychology and simplified it a bit. And he's very aware of the fact that he's done that and makes no pretense. He says, look, I'm going to try to make this sort of intelligible so we can reflect on this. And he has two aspects to that. He talks about intuitive thinking, which is what we do most of the time in making our decisions, and that's categorized as a system 1 behavior. And then he contrasts that with deliberative thinking, which is what we all want to do and what most of us are doing at YASA and we're doing in our risk center. How do we think in a more deliberative manner about things and thinking about that so we can systematically make decisions? And what he means by system 1, very quickly summarizing, is we make many of our decisions with simple associations, including very emotional reactions. We react to things in an emotional way. We highlight our own past experience, and in particular, we have a set of judgmental biases and simplified decision rules. And all of you know, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics because of his work with Amos Tversky on how we have these systematic biases that impact on our decision-making processes in a way that obviously people like Howard Kunreuther would clearly pay attention to, and that we're paying attention to in our own work. So here's the major point that Kahneman makes in his book. We make most of our decisions extraordinarily well with this kind of intuitive behavior because we've got a lot of past experience. We have decision rules that we know work over time. We have a basis for actually making those decisions in a way that actually does well. We do horribly with low probability, high consequence events. Horribly. And we do horribly because they don't happen very often. We want to ignore them. We have a whole set of biases that enable us to somehow say we're not going to pay attention to them now. Climate change is one of those events that is not necessarily low probability, but we behaved in that manner. And what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves, given the fact we behave this way, how do we get people to move towards deliberative thinking? How do we actually take some steps to get them to do the things that we are all trying to do in our own research? Make trade-offs using benefit-cost analysis in systematic ways. Recognize the relevant interdependencies and interconnectedness and need for coordination. And most important, how do we get all of us, and I'm guilty of all of this myself in a way, thinking long-term. How do we get long-term strategies for coping with extreme events? So let me highlight just some of the points with respect to the intuitive thinking so you get an idea of what I mean. And these are all based upon very, very detailed research. One of them is the availability bias. You estimate the probability of an event by its salience. So people do not buy insurance before a disaster. They will buy earthquake insurance and flood insurance, and this is the US, but I think it's around the world, if they're not required to buy it. They will buy it after a disaster, and at that point, of course, it's too late, but that's when they're worried, that's when it's salient, that's when they said, I better protect themselves. But a few years later, and this is the part that, of course, is very intriguing in terms of that, they cancel their policy. They said, God, I haven't collected on my premiums for the last 4 years. Look at what I could have done with those premiums. I could have had a vacation, I could have gone out, I could have done a lot of things, and they will actually say it's not worth it. And so as a result of that, they don't have the insurance the next time a disaster occurs. Now, there are other things that reinforce that. One is a decision rule that is very well documented, threshold models. This disaster, this event is below my threshold level of concern. I am not concerned about it because I don't want to worry about it. And so that is coupled with imperfect information. If I don't have good scientific data, if I misperceive the probability of the event, and I think it's a lot lower than it actually is, then that couples with a threshold model, and for the two of them together, basically say, I'm not going to worry about it, I'm not going to protect myself until after the disaster occurs, which is where the availability bias comes in. And the last one, which I think is the most important, is the one that we really have to deal with, which is myopia. The notion of our nearsightedness. I am not going to spend my money on making my house safer. It's too costly. The upfront costs are much too high relative to the benefits that I only think about for the next 2 or 3 years, not for the length of the house, which is what you should be thinking about if you do a benefit cost analysis. You should be saying, I'm reflecting on the fact that if I elevate my house, if I flood-proof my house, well, it should be something that I actually benefit over the 30-year life of the house. And I'll come back to that in a moment with respect to how one might deal with that. So these are some of the biases that come out with respect to this. Okay, let me give you a little example to highlight some of the challenges that one faces here. And we have a lowland family living in Steyr, considering whether to invest 1,500 euros to flood-proof their house so it is less susceptible to water damage. The hydrologist, Pavel being one of them, has estimated that the likelihood of the flood affecting their home is a 1 in 100 chance that they will have a flood. And if it occurs, the saving from flood proofing, the damage to the house will be 27,500 euros. Now, partly, this is hypothetical. We did similar kinds of data analysis in the US, just so you know, where we had dollars rather than euros. And this is kind of the data that you might get with respect to what you might do if you reduce the flood. So there's some realism to the data here. Whether it fits Steyr, I'm not exactly sure. Someone can let me know after the talk, or even that it might not be exact. But here's the point. The only point I want to make on that, if you have an insurance policy, and we'll just say that insurance policy is based on scientific data and reflects the risk, you will save, if you flood-proof your house, 275 euros on each year. This is just a risk-based calculation. They should reduce your premium by 275 euros in order to somehow say you have saved $27,500 with euros with a 1 in 100 chance, and so the average premium should go down each year by 275. That's the only point I sort of want to make with respect to how that would be calculated. If there's an administrative cost or other cost, it'll be a higher premium, but on a risk-based calculation, that's what it should be. Okay, what's the response by the lowland family? The response by the lowland family, yeah, I'm not going to do this. I think the probability is 1 in 1,000 rather than 1 in 100. It's below my level of concern. And I'm not going to think about the long-term benefits of flood protection. I'm going to think about the next year. And God, 275 doesn't look very large relative to the 1,500 that I have to spend. I have a lot of other things I could do with my budget. I have a lot of other things that I could sort of deal with. So I'm not going to invest in protection. So that's the outcome if they are following these kinds of biases, etc. So let's take a look at some guiding principles of insurance to sort of figure out essentially how one deals with that. Three guiding principles we want to put forward. This is one that no one will argue with on its own terms if you're looking at what insurance should do. Premiums should reflect risk. I mean, why shouldn't it reflect risk? Well, we'll come to that in a moment, but the fact is that they should reflect risk for two very important reasons. One is that if Pavel is living in and he knows this, but if he didn't know it, was living in a flood-prone area, and he gets a subsidized insurance premium and wasn't a hydrologist, he would say, gee, this risk is very low. I don't have to worry about it. So the minute a premium is subsidized, he basically sort of says, you know, I'm not too concerned about that. On the other hand, he also says, I have no incentive to mitigate because I'm not really, no insurer will ever give me a premium discount if I mitigate. Because the premium is so low, they're going to go out of business if they give you a premium discount of the 275 or whatever they should be getting. So everything works against giving people good information. You need accurate flood maps, number one, to do this. You need accurate damage curves and depth damage curves. But if you have that data, make that insurance premium. Whether you pay that premium or not is a second question. And that's the second principle I want to highlight. Dealing with equity and affordability. Those are the two principles. I'm going to focus on those two. There's a third one, multi-year insurance, I won't focus on here. I'll focus on just these two principles. The second principle basically says is you have to recognize affordability. You have to recognize equity. You are dead politically if you don't. You are dead on issues of fairness. You're a whole set of reasons. But don't do it through an insurance premium. If you want to do it, help the people who need money by giving them some kind of a voucher. Like a food stamp in our country gives a voucher to the low-income people who need food. Give them an insurance voucher. Do something that helps them to actually be able to afford that. But let them know what the premium is. You have to let them know what the actual premium is and then say, we're helping you out for the following reasons. And if you don't do that and you pretend that the two are coupled together as a subsidized premium, you have lost on every level. They don't have the correct information. They have no incentive to mitigate. And they are basically confused as to what it is. And so, in a sense, you still want to give them a premium discount if they mitigate, but you want to let them know through a voucher. And we are saying, in this case, give vouchers to people who are currently living in an area. If you give them to people who are not living there, you may attract them to the area. Now, there are whole other dimensions to that. What kind of areas do you want to have? And if you want to have a mixed area, maybe you have to modify that. But in general, you want to say, here are the people who are living in the area. Okay, so those are the two principles. Now let's take a look at the lowland family. Let's look at the lowland family very quickly. Here's essentially the data that I gave you a moment ago. We're going to look at how this plays out in a very deliberative fashion. We're going to look at benefit cost analysis and say, look, here is what the premiums are, what their benefits are, discounted at a very high rate, by the way, up to 10%. It would be lower. This would be a little bit higher, but it will never get up to the 1,500 euros. And for the length of the house, this is a very attractive investment. You're going to save at a discounted measure over 2,500 euros over the 30 years. But you have to pay, and remember that's important, you have to pay 1,500. If you're myopic and think only about the next 2 or 3 years, you're never going to want to do this because of the fact that, and if you have budget constraints, you certainly won't want to do it on that basis. So how do we deal with that? Well, here's one way to deal with it. We say, look, we're going to give you a 20-year loan. 20-year loan, tie it to the mortgage, or whatever they have, 1,500. What is it going to cost at an interest rate of 10%? Again, a very high interest rate. It would be a lower cost if it was a lower interest rate. 145 euros. Reduction in the insurance premium, 275 euros. This is a no-brainer for anyone at that point. Every year they save 130 euros because the long-term loan basically spreads the upfront cost over time. So we address myopia in a very simple way. We say the way we'll address myopia is basically looking at stretching the upfront cost over time. This is done with energy today on programs like the PACE program, and in California, they pay the upfront cost with respect to solar energy. In return, the person actually has a loan tied to their property, but they can show everyone that the actual reduction in the electricity cost is greater than the actual cost of the loan. And so this is a no-brainer for anyone investing in solar or wind. And the same idea here is in flood. The actual reduction in your insurance premium is going to be greater than the cost of the loan. So there are a lot of analogies to things that could be done in other areas, particularly related to climate change. Okay, so Here's the idea. I'm going to conclude fairly quickly because I think you get the basic idea. But here's what we've been proposing to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm going to talk fairly as part of a National Academy Committee that for full disclosure, I was on, dealing with affordability. And the idea basically is very, very straightforward. Whether you can ever implement that's another question. Risk-based premiums, long-term loans, premium reductions for mitigation, things I've just talked about. So these are encouraging investments in loss reduction measures. What about affordability? How are we going to deal with affordability? Means-tested vouchers, not only does it cover the insurance premium, it also covers the mitigation loan. So you tie the two together and say, if you're going to do this and you can't afford things, you basically look at what the person's income is and then use it as a mean-test addition. And here's the kicker that we feel is really important. And this is work that I've been doing with Carolyn Kuski, but other colleagues at the Risk Center as well, Aaron Michelle John, Jeff Sikowski, other people, we've all been working in this area. Condition for a voucher is you must mitigate. So the idea is you encourage loss reduction by saying, we're not going to give you anything back unless you do something if it's cost effective. Not everyone can mitigate, but if they have a cost effective measure, give them that back. And we have a multi-year insurance policy, and loans all tied to the property rather than the individual, so no one cancels. Now you can do this with the flood insurance program in the United States. I'm not going to talk much about that except to say it's a program where all homeowners buy from one insurer, the federal government. Premiums have been highly subsidized for existing homes. It's a major problem in terms of how you reduce those subsidies. There was a bill that was passed, Bill Glazer, who I know very well, as I think probably knows this, bigger orders bill that was passed in 2012, 3 months before Hurricane Sandy, that you all know about. We all had worked, the whole group of us with Congress, we were delighted with that bill. It had risk-based premiums that eventually were going to be phased in, and it had the notion of study on affordability by the National Academy of Sciences. Well, what happened? Hurricane Sandy occurred. I can tell you right now, if Hurricane Sandy occurred in July of 2012, that bill would never have been passed in October. Bigger Waters was passed in July. Hurricane Sandy happened in October. But after Hurricane Sandy and an election coming up in the United States on 2014, there was enormous revulsion against this bill. And it's very rare that a bill is ever changed in Congress, but this one was changed for two reasons. One is there was enormous concern with all of the areas hit by Sandy. You know, what are we going to do? Our insurance premiums may go way up. And in New Orleans and Louisiana and Mississippi after Katrina, Senator Landrieu, who was running for re-election in 2014, basically said, I'm going to do everything I can with a lot of other congressmen to change that legislation. And she and others were able to deal with this. It brings up the one acronym that I want to raise dealing with myopia. And I don't know how many people have heard. NIMTOF. Not in my term of office. That dominates the thinking, and that was clear. Like, Senator Landrieu did a remarkable job, and I really admire her because she has focused on affordability in her career. Turns out she didn't get reelected. We had new legislation that did get passed that delayed all of this on homeowners' affordability, but it did have the advantage of actually in getting a project going with the National Academy of Sciences that said, let's begin to rethink this problem. So this is the way we deal with it. Very quickly on some data. Carolyn and I did some data on one county in New Jersey just to illustrate this. And here's what we did. We looked at two families. This is a hypothetical example. Family one is in an A zone, pays $4,000 for insurance. That's what they would normally pay. An A zone has some risk, but not as high a risk as a V zone, which is high velocity. That's what the V stands for. We have both homes are 3 feet below the base floor flood elevation. The income of $50,000, and we said, suppose that we looked at the cost of elevating a home, which is what FEMA normally recognizes as a way of giving some kind of a benefit. And in the case of the family in the A zone, it was $25,000. In the case of the family in the B zone, it was $55,000. We gave them a 3% low-interest loan to be able to deal with that. And we said, just to illustrate, we'll give you a voucher if it turns out that the cost of this is over 5% of your annual income. That was the basis for our analysis. $2,500 would be 5% of $50,000. Here's what happens. If you only gave them a voucher alone, the federal government would actually have to spend a large amount of money with respect to the insurance voucher because the premium would be so high. But if you give them the mitigation measure and the loan for mitigation and tie that together, their premium goes way down because they have a much lower risk. And the cost to the federal government goes way down as a result of that. And after 20 years, it's even lower. What happens with respect to the A-zone property? It turns out if you give them a loan, tie everything there, they don't even need a voucher because their premium has gone down to such a low level if you had a risk-based premium that they actually could get away without it. So we then just so you see, how much it would cost the federal government just for this county in the context of an insurance voucher, and it would have been $140,000 just for that area. It goes down to less than half of that with respect to the mitigation loan, and after 20 years lower than that. So our idea is, if you couple this together, the federal government is better off in that, The homeowner is clearly better off, and the affordability issue is at least addressed, in our view, in a reasonable way. So let me conclude with a couple of very short remarks here so we have a few minutes for, and whatever time is available for discussion. First of all, my favorite icon is winner. If we can make everyone a winner, that would be nice. Well, everyone is a winner in theory, not in practice because it hasn't been implemented, but in theory they're a winner. The homeowner has a lower annual payments. The insurer has a reduction in flood losses because they now mitigated their homes. The financial institution, we require this as a condition for a federally insured mortgage, they have a much more secure investment due to lower losses. The public sector has lower voucher costs due to the reduced insurance premiums. And we, as general taxpayers, all of us, has less disaster assistance afterwards. So that's the basic idea. What's our problem? Here are some very quick points for challenges. How do we get the long-term strategies? Well, our notion is make things, deal with the short run in the way that you use loans, insurance premiums, so people see benefits in the short run. But how do we reduce the flood risk given climate change? Critical problem. What are the short-term incentives for encouraging this behavior? That's what we try to illustrate here. How do we develop a strategy that recognizes the importance of adaptation measures and affordability? That's the policy analysis. The future research ideas, one idea is a simple one, but I'll take a moment on that. Stretch the time horizon for giving people information on probability. And I will have to tell you, I gave a talk in Daniel Kahneman's class a few years ago where I basically did a little experiment. I told half the class it's a 1 in 100 chance of a flood next year, and gave them a notion of what would you pay for insurance to protect your house, and gave them some data on that. The other half of the class independently got the following information. There is a greater than 1 in 5 chance of at least one flood occurring in the next 25 years. How much would you pay for insurance next year for that policy? Just think about that. 2 separate groups, 2 separate bits of information. What do you think happened? Gunther, you?
I guess the 1 in 25 year example got more attention.
Yeah. More attention, paid a lot more, did everything that you think, and these students all have statistics. They all had. They were very embarrassed. I was very happy. They were very embarrassed when we came in. They paid 4 times as much for insurance and were much more. Those probabilities are identical. They're identical if you have if you know that probability is the same over the years. It would be even higher than 1 in 5 if you had climate change brought in because of the fact that you'd have sea level rise. So stretching time horizon gets people to think about that, and maybe they'll actually do something. Highlight the expected benefits of loss reduction to key interested parties. Tie the loans to the property. We've talked about that. Examine the role of multi-year insurance for dealing with that. Here are some of the challenges. How do we get better flood maps? Critical problem in the U.S., probably critical everywhere in the world. How do we get accurate flood maps with good hydrology, with good depth damage curves, and make sure that everyone understands it? Because you can't do any of this stuff if you don't have good risk assessment. How could you possibly even think about a risk-based premium unless you have risk information to give you a risk-based premium? Secondly, how can the impacts of climate change be incorporated in designing flood insurance to encourage investments? So climate change has to be brought in. How do we better communicate the risks as a part of this? And finally, how do we deal with the flood insurance affordability? Conclusions: insurance can help spread the risk of unavoidable disasters. We need to encourage deliberative thinking by focusing on the long term while providing short-term incentives for acting now rather than by assuming it will not happen to me. And I will end with 2 things. One of it is one of my favorite slides that Larry Lawson from the Association of Floodplain Managers gave me a few years back. I mean, this is one way to deal with flood insurance, but I'm not sure that it is the best way. Jerry looked into flood insurance, says it's too damned expensive. So here's what he did. And then would mention a book if any of you are interested in the issue of behavioral economics and insurance. Mark Pauly and I have written a book. We look at health insurance, we look at property insurance, and try to look at this. And our subtitle is what we truly feel: improving decisions in the most misunderstood industry. And on that note, let me turn it back to all of you, and thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
you, Howard. I think it was quite clear where the message was. I was just thinking, I don't know if you know that I'm Dutch, probably know this, and we've been dealing with this discussion for the last 100 years, and we still don't have insurance either, so that's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, that's right. The Dutch have done remarkable jobs on prevention, but we don't have flood insurance. That is true. We've been working with Adaptation in the area of arts and some people in
Talk
Holland.
about it days and nights, and then there's also...
Let's work together on this.
Sure, there is a nice story which is connecting about what you said, what was said about Howard Kunreuther. I was thinking about this. I think I told you this story. I would like to repeat it because it's very topical. I was a member of this governmental committee in Netherlands before I came here, which was the best experience of my life in science policy, called Delta Committee. Prime Minister Balkenende established a committee of 9 people, former Prime Minister, head of the bank, and 2 scientists, me, Marcel Steven from Delft. We were given this fantastic opportunity for 3 years to govern the country, basically. All the means possible. Everybody was working for us. Consulting with Prime Minister every week. And the simple question was how Netherlands should be redesigned by 2050 to cope not only with the risks, but also with the opportunities residing in these risks. So we came up with this Delta Committee report, which was presented to you on the website, which is a fantastic piece of system thinking in the way of how to change the country. And it has all these measures and all these, hard and soft measures and all these adaptive measures, all of that we talk about all the time. I don't know what I talk about. But there was this moment where I was thinking about the combining of the received communication, non-hard numbers, and the decision sign. It was in the Dutch Parliament, I think I wrote this story. We ended up in Dutch Parliament, 150 eager politicians from like 20 parties, and of course 3 of them do matter, but there is one which thinks matters a lot, which is the Dutch far-right conservative party. I don't tell you the name, but probably you know who it is. And I was the one who was voted by these 9 committee colleagues to present to the Parliament the story in 20 minutes, which I did. And then I ended with telling them, okay, my dear colleagues, this is all the way how it's done, and this is going to cost us, Netherlands, every year, €2 billion extra on top of what we are doing already. 2 billion. Right? It was 2009, just a year after Lehman Brothers and all this confusion. And this member of this conservative party, he stood up, and the way how these populists communicate, he said, Professor Kabat, you must be mad. You are a madman, simply. In fact, for those who are in Dutch. Just madman. How can you dare to come here and to ask 2 billion at the moment we are trying to save our banks and basically save our economy? How can you do that? Then I had this bright idea, which I'm very proud of still. I said, Mr. XY, I shouldn't say the name, but you know who it is. Do you own the house? He said, yes. You really say Limburg, which is a threat by rivers. So how much is it worth? I can check it so it wouldn't lie. Everything is open, transparent. He said €500,000. I said, okay. So I know how much you have because that's all transparent. 150K, by the way, is the Dutch Parliament list, if you want to know it. So how much do you pay? How it comes? For all the possible premies against things which may happen or not, like a fire, like everything else. And he gave me a number. And then I said, well, this is about 5% of your income, right? By the way, do you know how much is 2 billion of all we are earning together every year? 0.05%. Excellent. This is the way. This is exactly what this discussion is more about. This is what you were talking about. It's a perception, it's a communication, this is the way how it is. It's not only
I hope you could change a few people's minds that way.
Well,
you change his mind.
It is beyond numbers. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to change his mind. This is his problem. But I mean, it changed the communication. So I think it was topical on the whole discussion this morning. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for a few questions?
We have time for the questions. I will ask you to do that. I will ask John to step in because I need to go for other meeting. She's already waiting there patiently for me, and I see your face. I think I do around.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you, and I will see you later.
I look forward to that.
John,
good luck with your scientific advisory committee meetings. I know that's happening this afternoon. Thanks. Okay.
Okay, that's too bad because I've got some burning questions, but I'll put them up, being the person who's going to call on people. So Reinhard, why don't you ask the first question?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Howard, for first a nice talk about Howard Kunreuther, the other Howard, and your nice presentation.
Thank you.
But maybe a question on this madness and irrationality that Howard also came up with. You said this thing wasn't tested, your loan and grant fee. I mean, the Asian Development Bank tested exactly that. They had like a concessional loan facility out there for countries to do more of disaster risk management, but it was not taken up at all. It was really concessional lending, really no interest, basically zero interest. It wasn't taken up. And I think for many reasons, but I think one reason is also that you're taking money in the context that's where there's tight financial constraints, basically adding to your debt levels is quite prohibitive for many countries, and I think also for people. So currently we're in this.
Well, this is exactly the point, though, Reinhard, and let me take your question and raise it in the context of developing countries. I think that you absolutely have to have organizations like the World Bank, the International Development Fund, or the particularly let's focus on organizations that really have to be part of that solution. If affordability is going to be a very, very high problem in a developing country, then there are notions of quid pro quo. We are going to make sure that we will help you in aiding you and helping even on the issues of affordability if it turns out it happens to be country projects or even giving some kind of vouchers along these lines. But in return, there has to be steps taken by the country to enforce building codes, to deal with, I didn't mention that, but that becomes really critical. Countries like Turkey had enormous problems because of the earthquake without well-enforced building codes in 1999, and other things. And I think that has to be part of it. So I'm really glad you brought that up. What I said basically here was, in the United States, we're working on this, and we haven't been able to get it. The fact that other countries have tried it and have not been successful suggests that it can't be them alone. It may very well be that you have to do this on a more global level. And with climate change as a part of it, then I think you really do have a global problem that we really have to address. So I appreciate that question.
I think, I believe there was first.
And introduce yourself. I know Reinhard, but I want to make sure.
So Gunther, you know Gunther too.
Oh, I know Gunther, yes. We are tennis players from way back, I should say.
Small question. My question is, how would you suggest to extend the principles which you elaborated in cases where the risk is not a static risk, but changes because of external factors, say upland land use changes, climate change, other factors that you have no control over at the time or cannot know at the time when you make the decision to buy or build this house?
That's a great question, and I think there are two. Let me respond, I think, on two different levels. One is that when we have done a lot of work on multi-year insurance, which I did not put I didn't really put time in. We would say for 3 to 5 years, you're pretty safe, even with respect to things like climate change or these other things. And then you have to have a scientific body and renew. So if you're going to set premiums, you don't set it for a very long period of time. I think the most important thing that has to be done on that is, again, the risk communication. I've learned a great deal over the last couple of years. I'm on the Federal Emergency Management Agency Technical and Mapping Committee, where we have a report that comes out, not only an annual report, but future conditions. And one of the things that has come out in that is to say, what does it mean if you are going to mitigate or elevate a house or make a house, not only for the next year, but for the next 25 years or 30 years, and bring the climate change as best you can, the estimates with it. So that in some sense, there's a long-term communication problem that has to be dealt with, and that's what we're struggling with the mapping committee, because maps are going to change. And you can say, here's a flood map today, but it's not necessarily going to be the flood map that you're going to have in the future. So the best that we feel we can do there is to highlight the uncertainties, because there are uncertainties around them, talk about the future conditions so that one doesn't think about next year, and that people think about adaptation in a way that actually addresses the long-term problem rather than necessarily the short-term. But at the same time say, if we're going to set an insurance premium, it may very well be that that premium may have to change 5 years from now if it turns out that there are new conditions that are actually merit that. And our feeling is, at least if you get the information out about what's likely to happen over a 20-year, what will happen to sea level rise as best the experts can estimate it, you have a better chance of getting people to do the right thing now, recognizing that if they have a house and they're only flood-proofing for what they see next year, they actually may lose in the long term in terms of what might actually happen to them, or to their children or grandchildren.
It brings also up the question, what is fair? Who should pay for this? That changes.
Well, We always raise that question as we're talking about. We made a decision in our risk center, and Joanne and I have had long discussions on this, and with others as well, and part of the Zurich project, that we will never get into the answer of who should pay. That's a country decision. That's a cultural decision. We could tell you the implications, as I did over here, but who should pay? What Austria has to say something that I couldn't say anything about, that you couldn't say, that the Austrian government couldn't say a lot better. And Pavel had his own little story on who should pay that for the Netherlands.
I'm Wolf Diekmann with the Evolution and Ecology Program. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk and also for your touching words about Reuther. It was very kind. I wanted to express my happiness with your emphasizing behavioral economics so much and bound rationality so much. I think here at JASA we have also recognized the importance of that, even though maybe we are struggling a little bit with making it part of the mainstream models, but it certainly has to be done. I wanted to challenge you a little bit with connecting that, I think, future trend, even though it deserves to be a future trend already since 50 years, when it was highlighted maybe for the first time as bound rationality. I want to connect that a little bit with the issue of heterogeneity, which I think is another future trend which we are seeing in many systems analysis. Our stakeholders are not uniform. We cannot speak of the average stakeholder, which is as a single batch of properties representing the distribution of stakeholders. And now taking these two things together, I believe that different people who want to take out insurances have different cognitive biases, have different limitations, have different problems, so to speak, with seeing the cost-benefit full picture. They may suffer from risk avoidance, they may suffer from inequality avoidance, if you want to call that a suffer, can also be a boon. They may have this ostrich policy, which ignores low probability events. So don't we need to somehow customize in a more holistic, more diverse way what you have described for the average?
It's a wonderful question because, I mean, in some sense, we all recognize just the fact that one message may not get across to everyone, and I think one has to recognize that. I think I see two things. Let me respond on two levels. One is, I think there's a message that should get across to everyone with respect to insurance, no matter how they behave, and that is, and we have a hard time knowing how to do it, the best return on an insurance policy is no return at all. That you should celebrate the fact you haven't had a loss. And everyone needs to recognize what insurance is doing. And we have never been able to get the insurance industry, we've been sort of struggling with how you pay attention. The closest we came, and this is a proposal we'd like to see implemented, is you need to give people something back if they don't have a loss, so that they feel they're gaining something. And our idea was that what you give them is, you give them 80 euros, 50 euros, and say, look, go out and celebrate the fact you have not had a loss this year, and have a dinner on us to celebrate that you haven't had a loss, so that they recognize that that's what insurance is. And I think you can do that with everyone, whether or not it happens to be a person who has different views. The other one, I think, is a lot more difficult in the fact that some people don't misperceive, they have different decision rules. And that one, I'd like to talk with you maybe offline and while I'm here, because I think that the challenge is, if you have too many different, if you don't know anything about the individuals in advance, I don't know quite what you do. And if you try to get some information on what they are, then we should figure a way to deal with that. And one of the reasons I want to talk with you about it is we're now working with the White House and with FEMA on risk communication. We're doing a whole project of figuring out how we can communicate information on flood insurance, because they've been unsuccessful in getting a large number of people to purchase it. And it would be very interesting to get an idea on what we would do to implement what you're talking about, and how one would do it. I don't have an easy answer to that one.
Let me just follow up on that for a minute, then I'll get to you, Jerry, if it's okay. Yeah, I think I really appreciate what Ulf was saying, that, you know, we are looking here, you know, we're looking at a kind of average person, and you're saying that the average person has all these biases, but I think it'd be really interesting to try to look and see, you know, are these biases, does everybody have those biases, and how might that do, and how will that change, particularly if you move into this communication area. And I have just a couple of questions on responsibility, which I think are really important, but I'll ask Jerry first to give the last comment, then I'll try to get a couple of comments in, because I think we'll have to end very soon, yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk, but as somebody who's dabbled in extreme value statistics, two immediate second-order problems occurred to me that I'm sure you're aware of that you didn't mention. The first is, by definition, extreme events are extremely rare, which means that in historical observations, they will happen either in very small numbers or not at all. Which means, as you're well aware, that any statistical estimate of the probability has a small numbers problem, which means its variance goes up very rapidly with the rarity of the underlying event. Which means there's an additional second-order problem of uncertainty, and that is you don't know how uncertain your estimate is of the extreme value analysis, and in what that benefits decisions, this will play a big role. Be very sensitive to the uncertainty of the underlying estimator. So a good example I can give you in practical world is Fukushima. When they built the Fukushima atomic reactors, they made an estimate of the probability of getting a tsunami, and they built a seawall on the basis of a cost estimate. So it turns out, retrospectively, we know they vastly underestimated the probability of such a large tsunami. But based on the historical observations they had, they did it correctly. However, considering that these are very rare events, there were very few tsunamis of that magnitude in the historical record, the uncertainty was extremely high in the second order. The second observation I'm sure you're also aware of, and that is the moral hazard aspect of insurance. If we can present insurance, and in particular mitigation insurance against extreme events like climate change, aren't we perhaps unconsciously encouraging people to indulge in risky behaviors like settle in coastlines and settle in floodplains, and they're creating a bad decision by the illusion that insurance has mitigated their risk. And a good example of that is in financial industry. Credit default swaps are essentially insurance against major defaults, but they didn't actually insure you against systemic defaults because you had a second order problem. You couldn't believe that you couldn't be sure that the issuer of a credit default swap could actually honor it in a breach if you were actually in such a big event.
Okay, so let me respond to both very, very relevant points. Let me look at the last one first on the mitigation aspect, and also address the credit default and the other thing just peripherally. I mean, the view that we have with respect to, I mean, a moral hazard is always a problem when we spend a lot of time obviously thinking about it. The point that I would make on moral hazard is, if you actually are giving people a premium reduction that is your best estimate of what the risk will be, like along the lines of what I'm saying, then you really don't have a moral hazard problem, because at that point the person is benefiting from taking the mitigation measure in such a way that they are rewarded. You clearly have a moral hazard problem with some of the things that we were talking about in the Austrian system and the US system with respect to people saying, why should I buy insurance if I can be rescued? So I think in some sense that aspect is an important component. On the credit default and on that aspect, I mean, I think the biggest problem on that is on a very different level, that no one wanted to even think about those kinds of risks, whether they knew it or not, simply because of the fact that if they did that and they were actually protecting themselves against it, they may not be in business at all on a competitive level, because they would be charging higher prices and there were others who were dealing with it. So I think that's a really much broader issue with respect to that, in terms of how do you deal with regulations and well-enforced regulations, which I didn't talk much about, and well-enforced like building codes or regulations on the financial industry, which has its own problems. But I think there are those issues. Moral hazard has to be part of it. On Fukushima and on uncertainty, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no question, and we have just your own, we don't know each other well, but we will get to know each other, I'm sure, after this question. We've done a lot of work on ambiguity and uncertainty, and clearly that's a critical issue. The problem in the context of insurance is you have to set a premium. You have no choice. You can't deal with uncertainty on a premium. There has to be some probability estimate that you have to give to set an insurance premium. The question is, what probability estimate do you give? And in some sense, the probability estimate may be the average of what experts say. It's maybe the best. There has to be a wide range of uncertainty. We're spending an enormous amount of time in the FEMA TMAC committee committee on exactly how do you even present uncertainty to people who don't like uncertainty. People don't like to deal with uncertainty. So you have that problem with respect to that. Fukushima, I will raise one point, and we can discuss it afterwards because I know we have to break. But my view, and we did a lot of work in our risk center on Japan and Fukushima, is there was enough information from historical data to say you should not have built the plant where they built it. They may have actually said they didn't know the amount, but if you looked at the historical record on tsunamis and other things, those events had occurred in the past, and everyone would have known had an event like that occurred in the future, it would have destroyed that plant. And we looked at a lot of historical data, which was ignored at the time that it was built. It isn't that you're not, I mean, I agree with you that there was a lot of uncertainty, but they could have looked at a historical record and said, did we really want to build that plant in that particular location? And everything we have read suggests that they shouldn't have. That they should have looked at the historical record, no matter how low probability, and those tsunamis, and they should have put it elsewhere. So I'll leave on that note, which I should give you the last word, given the fact that I said that, but that we should talk about
I think it would be very good to meet up. Howard's going to be here, by the way, for everybody. He's going to be here for 3 days. So,
delighted to continue this dialogue.
And I'll end, Howard, just with and something that we can discuss forward, because I don't think there'll be enough time to answer it. But I think there's, Howard is here, and we're going to be sitting down with several people, also not Root, talking about how you're going to balance off this kind of efficiency, equity notion. Efficiency, and you want people to reduce their losses, risk their losses, and equity is that you want to be fair about it. And I think there's obviously a trade-off here. On the both things, I think one thing that hasn't been taken into account, well, two things actually, when you're trying to put up your principles and so, that if in fact what you're doing, and let's forget the vouchers, let's say everybody's a middle-class community and we don't have poor people, and you say everybody now should pay their risk-based premium, good, so you've loaded the whole risk onto the house owners, right? Everybody is going to have that incentive. Now the government, and let's say it's a small
Except
country,
the affordability has to be addressed.
but forget it. This is middle-class people that can all
middle
afford
class,
it.
okay.
This is people that can all afford it. And you have the government who, if they, if it comes in with, as you said, they'll be a winner, they won't have any more to come in with their relief afterward. No subsidies, but even without relief, because you've got everybody insured completely, okay? Now, what if, in that situation, the most cost-effective mitigation measures can actually be done by the government? I mean, this is what's happening in England. The most cost-effective measures can be done by the government, but now the government says, I have no incentive to do these measures because I'll have no expenses after the disaster. Everybody's insured. And so I agree, every household will have huge incentive now to mitigate, but the most cost-effective ones actually are done by the government.
I'm going to give a one-sentence answer because of what you just said. But the answer that I would give is that if the government is looking out in the long term on reducing the risk, they would do the following. They would say, we have a measure that will reduce everyone's risk by putting a levee or a dam or doing something for a community, which I didn't talk about at all. And we're going to tax everyone a certain amount of money to make sure that we can support that measure, and they would use a tax to be able to deal with it. I'll leave it. That's a long German sentence.
They all get their premiums reduced. So
we
everyone will
keep
be
them-
behind.
And the premiums will go down, and so everyone will be happy to pay the taxes because they'll have lower premiums. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, sorry, Tanya, I didn't get to your question. And so it's a real pleasure now, and actually he was my boss, of course, as the leader. And
She's my boss now. Okay, thanks for all for coming.